Welcome to Midlife Unfiltered, a podcast about unapologetically embracing the season of me as we live the lives we want in midlife and beyond. I'm Anita McLaughlin.
I'm Erica Webb. We're here to make some noise, say hell no to outdated stereotypes, and hell yes to living life on our terms. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Midlife Unfiltered. How are you, Anita?
I am really well, Erica. How are you?
I am doing great. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Kirstin. So welcome, Kirstin. It's so good to have you back.
It is fun. I really enjoyed having a chat with you ladies last time, and it's pretty cool that I get to do it again. So thank you for having me.
You are so welcome. We had a little conversation. So the context building for this, Anita and I had a conversation a few weeks ago on the podcast now about the fact that I have been going through the process of being assessed for autism and ADHD after, I think, the normal way of adult women finding this out, typically, children being assessed or things happen in midlife that bring these qualities much more to the surface. And we were talking after we recorded that episode and said, we really need to get Kirstin back, because we did briefly touch on that conversation last time we spoke. I don't know if it was in the recording or if we just had that conversation offline, but we're really excited to have this conversation, because what we're seeing and what we know is that a lot of women in midlife are being diagnosed with ADHD and autism as well, but we're going to specifically talk about ADHD today. And that's why we've invited you back in, because I know that's part of your story. And we want to talk a little bit about why are we seeing this? What is the impact for us? And specifically, what do we need to know about neurodivergence in midlife? Because I think what I'm certainly learning is it's a little bit of an interesting kind of, I don't want to use the word storm, but that's the word that's coming to mind. Should we start with, I know I know you're returning, so people might know who you are and what you do, but can we maybe just start there with an introduction of who you are, what you do, and why ADHD is a topic close to your heart?
Yeah, sure. So I think next year I managed to clock over 30 years as a psychologist, which is super cool, and clearly
Impressive.
Only because I went straight from school. But I've had, I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist. So my early career actually started more in child protection, family court, prisons, all of that kind of jazz. I supervise people who still work in that space, but 10 or 12 years into it, I was really feeling that I wanted a change. I wanted, in terms of my client-facing work, I wanted to be working in a different space. And how that kind of evolved actually was from child protection work. I was doing a lot of assessments for court around whether mothers were able to have their babies returned to their care when they hadn't been able to have them because of safety kind of reasons, significant safety issues. And it really pushed me into understanding infant mental health and perinatal mental health and all that kind of stuff. And so I got a real taste for it in that, what I call the pointy end of the world. And so owning a private practice, a group practice at the time, which I had for 18 years and sold last year, I brought that into my private practice and started working with women in the perinatal space. And in that context, started to hear about perimenopause in the sense of I'm having trouble conceiving my second or my third. The fertility guy is saying that it's because I'm perimenopausal, and that's kind of also when I started to hear and learn about perimenopause, not from a personal lived experience at that point in time. But yeah, that's where I got exposed to that. Moving along in my career, doing a lot of that kind of stuff, and then hitting perimenopause, but only really knowing that a couple of years later, into my perimenopause journey, a lot of things, mainly me, were falling apart and really struggling with things that always, in hindsight, I now know the effort I had to put into juggling all the things, particularly once I became a mum and a working mom. And when I kept adding children to the tribe, so I knew I had to put effort in retrospectively. I could see that. But at the time I didn't know. It was just like I was in a permanent state of fatigue. Isn't that the norm for mums? We've come to accept that that's normal. But when perimenopause really kind of took a hold, I wasn't even able to do that anymore. And I really struggled. Professionally, for the first time, I struggled. Home stuff, I mean, my kids are deeply important to me, but it never kind of worried me that I was someone who needed to do the washing maybe 3 or 4 times because I kept forgetting to take it out and hang it out. That wasn't so, it was a bit frustrating, but it wasn't so important to me. But those kinds of running a home and all the executive function that's required in running a home and supporting kids, because essentially for a long period of time, we are their executive functioning. All of that really was taking its toll. Still didn't occur to me, though, to have myself assessed until the typical scenario where my youngest, who I had wondered for a long time, I have 3 sons, I'd wondered for a long time if he was an ADHD, but the teachers kept saying, oh, gosh, you've got 3 boys. You know what they're like. Boys are just like that. I'd be like, oh, okay, I'm not I guess at that time I definitely wasn't the expert. I'm not the expert, right? And then his challenges really emerged in high school when the expectations of children change. And his first year of high school was COVID, which was nowhere near as bad in Perth as, particularly Victoria and other parts of Australia and the world. But it was enough for me to kind of really start thinking, hang on a minute, I think there's something more going on here. And so I did get him assessed. And I have a lot of... I really like a psychologist's approach to assessing for these kinds of things because they're extremely thorough approaches. And so I took him off to a psych and he got a diagnosis. Then my eldest got a diagnosis and he's nearly 25 and he was probably about 20, 21 at the time. And then my middle son kind of a year or two after that hit year 11. And he was always a quiet soul, very compliant, easygoing. Teachers loved him. And he was an okay student, but with the added requirements of year 11 and 12, that's when we started to see the wheels fall off. And, the advantage of being a psych, I have lots of friends who are psychs, lots of friends who work in this space, and they said, it's very common for the inattentive type ADHD for that really not to reveal itself until, the higher demands are placed on them in that upper school kind of environment. So he was the last to be diagnosed out of my 3 sons. My eldest has a different dad. So I am the common theme in amongst this all. And
in your little research experiment.
Yeah, my little social research experiment for sure. And it was at that point that I certainly, like all parents, when they're answering questionnaires, they can see themselves in, some of the questions that are being asked and the answers that they're giving for their kids. And so then I did ask my friends who work in the neurodivergent space, do you think I'm an ADHD? And they were like, God, yes. I'm like, you didn't think to tell me? Like, hello. Would have been helpful. And because they're ADHDers themselves, and also some are audio ADHDers, it was just like, well, it kind of wasn't relevant to them, to share that with me. And so I went and got myself assessed and landed with a diagnosis, which I have to admit, I didn't believe for a year. I was still very much, she's just, I know I know the answers to give. So I just gave them because, now, I know what to say, even though it's not intentional. And she got me at my lowest point. I am perimenopausal because I knew that by that stage, and it's just perimenopause. So there were a lot of things that discounted it for me. But I nonetheless still went and saw a psychologist to kind of tease it all apart, make sense of it, also better support my own children, get my understanding, improve that area and things. And it was in the course of that she very gently, beautifully talked about my career. She got to know me and she's like, jokingly, she said, your career is actually diagnostic in and of itself. And that was a clincher for me, because I'd always felt like a square peg in a round hole in my Gen X. The way I did my career was very unusual for that time in the world. And how it unfolded was, it's quite common now, but for Gen Xers starting their careers in their early 20s, I did things very, very differently. And I didn't know why that needed to happen. And so then it was like, okay, I accept this now. So that's my journey into it, and definitely why I'm super committed to working with midlife women. I mean, I love midlife women anyway. We are all so fabulous, really. And a big portion of my work is with midlife women who've been late diagnosed, because perimenopause is such an identity discombobulating time as it is, let alone when you also add a late diagnosis that you now have to make sense of, and how does this fit, and where does ADHD show up for me as a midlife woman. So I spend a lot of time with brilliant women, as I said, midlife women, some of whom are ADHDers. So a very long-winded answer to your question, but that's me.
I love a long-winded answer. Give me all the details.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it so much. But maybe I'm just thinking maybe what would be really helpful for anyone listening, because I think I had a similar story. My kids are younger, but I never ever considered it for myself ever. And I was sitting in front of one of my kids' psychologists, and they were like, "Have you ever thought about the fact that it might be you?" And I literally just had this moment. I'd sort of seen myself in the paperwork, as you said, and I had already started to have that suspicion with autism, but not ADHD. And the way that I told the story to the psychologist, he just looked at me and he was like, "What do you think?" And I was like, "Oh." Maybe. Yeah, actually, that makes a lot of sense. But I think part of it is a lack of understanding of what it is and what it means and how it shows up.
Yes.
So could we talk a little bit about that? Because you kind of quietly mentioned the inattentive sort of form of ADHD. And I think most people have the more stereotyped, hyperactive young male in their mind when they think of ADHD, because I certainly fit the more like good girl. I was a very good student. I sat in my seat. I did what I was told. This was really busy, and it's shown up in different ways later on. But do you want to explain a little bit about those two different kinds of ADHD before we dive a little bit more into the midlife conversation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're completely right. Like most health things, signs, symptoms, whether it's mental health or physical health, of course, it's been based on males, and it's absolutely prevalent in mental health conditions, and also in neurodevelopmental conditions and differences as well. So that is why we all have that particular stereotype. And let me add that I finished my training in 97. I finished my master's, and there was nothing at all in my training on neurodivergence at all. Not even the typical boy version of it, right? So and it wasn't an area I gravitated towards. A lot of psychs who have worked in this area for a really long time usually had that strong drive to work with kids, so they would have come across it. I really wasn't interested in working with children, to be honest, and I've only done a little bit of it. But yeah, there's actually 3 types of ADHD, and one is inattentive, one is hyperactive, impulsive, and the third is the combination of both. So they call it the combined type. And the criteria has typically been developed on males, and so that is why the general community if they've known about ADHD, the picture is, I mean, I remember those kind of Today Tonight shows, right, where they'd be interviewing this poor mother who's at her wit's end because her young son is bouncing off the walls, emotionally dysregulated, behaviorally dysregulated, sometimes even aggressive, not engaged at school, a handful at school, being expelled, all of that. That's the typical picture that we had back then. And, certainly if that's what's going on for a young boy, then, that's something to look at and consider as a diagnosis. But hyperactivity doesn't actually have to be that full on. I mentioned my son. I wondered for him for a long time, and that wasn't because he was, at that extreme level of hyperactivity. He's certainly never been aggressive. He's just been a very, very, very busy boy. Who couldn't sit still, who interrupted, who blurted out, who would never put his hand up to talk first. I just would talk, all of those kind of classic signs, which a lot of little boys who aren't ADHDers also have that. It's when that kind of also continues through the stage of life. So the hyperactivity impulsive style is very much typically very busy, and, unable to inhibit impulses. The bit that's been missing in the hyperactivity impulsive picture is how it often looks for women, which you don't see. And that is the very busy head. So the hyperactivity is more a cognitive hyperactivity, constantly thinking, a lot of noise in their head. But you can have that and be physically quite still. Or the behavioural expression for girls and women in the hyperactivity. And I've had clients tell me this for decades before I knew. You move so much in your chair, Kirstin. I'm like, I just can't be comfortable for very long. That was my answer. I know I do, but I just can't stay comfortable in one position for very long. So moving in our chair, crossing and uncrossing our legs, fingernails, biting nails, twirling hair, touching hair necklaces. I mean, you would have seen me do all of this already. Mm-hmm. These are the ways that they show up. So we can still be behaviorally busy, but it's just not this kind of grand, really obvious behavior. We can do it in a far more subtle behavior. The impulsivity, if you've had on your report card, again, this is not diagnostic in and of itself, let me mention that, but a lot of women will say to me, yes, on my report card, she interrupts, she talks too much, those kinds of things. And I'm definitely, being a psychologist has actually really helped me in some ways become a bit more socially acceptable and neurotypical in my presentation. I can bite my tongue, I can stop myself from interrupting. I can at times stop myself into saying inappropriate things, because these are all kind of skills that are shaped through being a psychologist. But prior to that, I can tell you that I blurted out, I said inappropriate things that I would die on the inside afterwards, either because it was embarrassing or unintentionally embarrassing for somebody else or hurtful for somebody else. The interrupting was kind of a big thing as well, and talking a lot, very much. So that is a common version of the impulsivity in females. Yes, and males can do that too. But in the absence of these really big overt behavioural kind of expressions of it, these are the more subtle ways. Inattentive, on the other hand, is and that is the reason it's more common in why it's more picked up in girls as inattentive is because there's that daydreaming. There's that off with the fairies, staring out the window, which often, there can be a version of inattentive where there's not much going on in your mind as you're staring out the window. Or the inattentive where you're staring out the window because you're actually busy thinking about something else. And so that's where the hyperactivity can kind of come into it as well. And certainly, as I said, my second son is inattentive type. And, even when he was little, he'd be he'd just be seemingly not very present. Interestingly, he was often very in tune with the conversations that were going on. But he could hold that at the same time, and he would I want to cure cancer, Mum. Or I would he was a very deep thinker little fellow, at 8 or 9, which I just thought was so sweet that he was really thinking deeply about these things. I'm like, this kid could be a psychologist, when he's older. But yeah, he was very, very inattentive. And the reason it showed up in his higher school years is when you're inattentive, you miss stuff in school. You're not paying attention. But the content is enough that you can nudge your friend next door and kind of say, what did I miss? And you can catch up that way. once you're getting high volumes of content, particularly in certain subjects, there's just like human bile, and bile is just content heavy, history, content heavy. Those kinds of subjects, you just can't stay on top of it if you're not paying attention all the time. And so, yeah, these are the different types that you can have. I'm combined type as well. So, and a classic example, and we can laugh about it now as a family because we all do it, but we might start listening to the beginning of a sentence that somebody said, but then I've wandered off by the end and it's like, oh, could you just say that last bit again? But we all do it. So my kids and I, have some compassion and grace for one another because we're all guilty of this particular problem of tuning out. And of course, combine that with the rambling that I can do as I'm doing now, lots of words, and there's even more reason to be tuning out because none of us are concise.
That's the irony, isn't it? It's like we are verbose and also can't focus on.
And part of the verboseness is because we are verbal processors.
Yes.
So because of some of the working memory issues, because of some of the processing speed issues, I mean, ADHDers can be super fast processors. And this is another reason why we can interrupt, because it's like, for God's sake, finish that sentence.
I know what you're going to say.
Can you just catch up? Yeah.
Yeah. But we need the reason we can be very verbose is because it's our way of hanging on to information that we would otherwise lose because our working memory is not necessarily the best.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's kind of a bit of a rundown on the different types of things. Yeah.
I really appreciate that explanation because I think some of the things that you said there, I mean, I don't know about you, Anita, but I just hear that and I'm like, isn't that what everyone does? Like, I think that's, and I've had that comment to me quite a few times recently because I've been quite open about the fact that I'm being assessed. And people will say, oh, what makes you think that people are particularly fascinated by the autism part, which is not really what we're talking about today, but they'll say like, why do you think that? And when you explain it, so many of my friends are like, but I think that's how I feel. That's what I do. Yeah. And I think that might be part of the reason why we don't really see that there might be something there that's maybe different to the norm because we've somehow surrounded ourselves with people that are like us. But also you don't know any other way. You don't ever know what's going on in somebody else's head. So you have no way of comparing what's happening in my head, not right, it's not the right word, but, different to the way that other people experience the world.
We're getting into people's heads, but in a way that ever showed me these kinds of differences. Getting into people's heads is like getting a sense of what their beliefs are and, how they see themselves and that self-talk kind of thing. But the self-talk doesn't necessarily speak to ADHD only kind of things. So that's the confusing thing. And so, yes, I agree with you, though. You're probably surrounded by a lot of people who are unknowingly neurodivergent. Some might know that, but others may not. I think the other factor as well, though, and the psych that I saw explained this to me because I was getting frustrated when I was trying to explain, again, why was I diagnosed with ADHD? And I'd get a lot of, but I do that, but I do that, but I do that. And I'm sure some of them do that because they're neurodivergent and, don't want to go down that path. But the way my psych explained it to me, and I've really hung on to this, is, yes, we all go to the toilet, don't we? It's a very normal thing. We all go to the toilet. But if you're going to the toilet 30, 40, 50 times a day, it's a problem. And I think that really really helped me explain things to the naysayers, is that, yes, we all lose our keys, we all might misplace our phone, we all might wash our clothes 3 times before we remember to hang them out. We all might interrupt at times, we all might feel fidgety at times, but it's the degree to which those things are happening and how they impact our lives. I mean, one of the most significant criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD is how it has to impair our functioning. So, which then again, a lot of women will say prior to perimenopause, a lot of women will say, but it didn't. I got stuff done. And it's like, okay, but how much effort did it take you to be able to do those kinds of things? And we're yet to really develop. We've got screeners for ADHD, and screeners are not diagnostic tools. They're just a bit of a, yeah, this is possible. You might want to go off and have a formal kind of assessment process. But one of the things that's missing in the screener kind of domain is a screener for what's called compensatory strategies, because that's typically like there's a very standard tool, the ASRS, that is a self-report. You can Google it, you can do it online, you can see your results, all the whole shebang. I don't lose my phone often. I don't lose my keys often. There's lots of things I don't do. So if I was just checking boxes of, rarely, sometimes, often, always, like I'd be down the rarely, sometimes. But what I realized is how many strategies I have in place to ensure that I turn up to appointments on time that are not regular things. Like I don't need an alarm to tell me to put my bins out on Wednesday night, because it's been Wednesday night since I've lived in this house, right? So it's every week. I know that, right? I don't need that reminder. But when it's something that isn't a common thing, isn't a regular thing, or hasn't yet become a regular thing, I have multiple alarms. I have half an hour before, I have 1 hour before, I have 1 day before. I've really tried to build, and he's just going, oh my God. I really tried to build a habit of checking my calendar for the next day. And I really had to build the habit, particularly in perimenopause. I was better at this before I hit because I'm menopausal now, but before I hit this stage of life, I actually could hold most, maybe not client by client in my mind of who I was seeing at 9 and 10, and all that kind of thing in my working life. But I could hold a lot more in my memory of where I needed to be and what I needed to do. Not to some level that some people can do, but definitely more than I could now. And so I've had to really build the habit now and in this stage of my life of not agreeing to do anything until I've actually checked my calendar. Like I really, and then in my calendar, I also have had to put the habit in of, and not just, how in your calendar you put the location. That's not necessarily visible for me. So in the calendar, for example, with you guys, in my calendar was today, and it was online at home, because I don't have to drive anywhere. But if I had to drive anywhere to go to it, I would really need that visual prompt. I can't just rely on knowing, oh, no, actually, Anita and Erica are meeting at location X. I would need to name it right next to the actual appointment itself. These are the things I've had to do that other people just don't have to do. That's what I've learned. Other people don't have to do that.
Really? So that's fascinating. I'm like, doesn't everybody have to do that? Like, I have to always put buffer time for my travel in my calendar. Otherwise, I will not show up. Like, yeah.
Yes. So I book it.
Anita's like got light bulbs going off. I can see it.
Half an hour or half an hour later, I have to put the actual time in as well.
Yes, yes, because you've got to put the buffer, and exactly.
But then I've got to make sure. Oh, was it a buffer that I put in, or was
That's
it
right?
I needed to
appointments at 2.
Yes, and it's in my calendar for 1:30 to whatever. Yeah,
I do exactly the same thing, Kirstin.
I've got this little prompting system at home where now I chop up bits of paper that are about this big, and I write washing on there, and I put it on my visual calendar that I physically write on, that I can see, because I'm a visual person as well. So if I can see it, I've got a chance of doing it. Whereas if it's buried in my phone, I might not see it. And so I've got all these little prompts, like even soup, right? So I make a pot of soup and I put it on the stovetop. But if I put the lid on it, I might forget that there's actually soup inside, and it can sit there for a week before I realise that I've made the soup and I need to put it away in the fridge or whatever. So but again, I just thought that was me forgetting things as I'm getting older occasionally. But now that you're talking, I'm just going, shit, maybe that's it.
And these
and not that that's a big deal, but it's kind of like,
well, no, I mean, these are the small things that in and of itself you kind of think, not a big deal. But when you're having to do that for all the things that you have to do that for when you're running a home and you're working and all the rest and stuff. It adds up. It is, it's an ADHD kind of tax. There's a financial tax to ADHD. I don't know if you've heard that phrase, ADHD tax. I have multiple offices. So I only have one laptop, but I have multiple keyboards, multiple mouse, I have multiples of things because I know how forgetful I am. And I also don't want to have to put the effort into, like, I try and choose what tasks can I just make easier for myself and what tasks will I still have to put effort into. So I could choose to not have multiple things at my offices, but what that would mean is I would have to make a lot of effort to always bring the right stuff as I'm moving around offices. And I'm like, yep, it's expensive to have 3 Apple keyboards and 3 this and 3 that. But I'm choosing to do that. So it's one less thing where there's effort required. Because there's so much effort required in other things that I can't manage in that same way. It's a real thing. So it adds up. The emotional cost, the bandwidth that it takes is a real thing.
And I reckon I don't know what the right word is. I'm not sure if it's shame. It might be. But like, I know I get through the week and there's weeks where I'm like, oh, I forgot that I need to wash stuff. Like, I literally forget that we have to do washing. I don't think about it. And then I get to the end of the week and I'm like, nobody has any undies. Like, because I didn't remember to put the washing on, because I don't do it at a regular interval. I just kind of hope that I see it one morning and go, that needs to be put on. And it's like I have often joked about what a bad housekeeper I am, because I'm terrible. Like I really have a hard time staying on top of housework, partly because I don't like it, but partly because I just don't think about it. And there is an element of like self-criticism, I think, that can come with that, or when your strategies stop working as well. So like this last year, I have had sort of like a post-traumatic exhaustion and all of the things, and the way that those symptoms have shown up in that period of time have been crazy, and the strategies that I had stopped working. And suddenly it's like, oh, I just can't get so many things done that I used to be able to get done because the load on the system's too high. So that leads me to asking the question of, how do you see these symptoms shift for people, or how does the impact change in midlife to the point that women are going, hang on a minute, maybe ADHD has been part of my story all along and I just didn't know. What's happening in us that makes it so much more challenging, or the mask starts to fall off? Like, what's actually going on?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of factors going on, and I'll start with burnout. Because, and it was funny, before I jumped on to chat with you ladies, I was talking to another psychologist who specialises in working with burnt out midlife women. And, I said to her, somewhat flippantly, but it's also true, like, I almost don't know any midlife woman who isn't teetering on the edge of burnout or have experienced burnout. And I had to take 2 years out of my clinical work. I was still running my business, but I had to slow that down because I had a physical collapse, and it led to a whole bunch of things that I really needed to address. And so I think all the research shows that midlife is the most demanding, stressful time for men and women, but particularly women. So we know that. And that will come as no surprise to your midlife listeners, I'm quite sure. So we've got the busyness of life and all the responsibilities and demands that come with it. And as I said, we're the executive function for other people at this stage as well. If you've got kids, we're probably the executive function for kids. We're often the executive functioning for partners. If you don't have a partner, then you also don't have anyone to offload the executive functioning to. Maybe even the executive functioning for elderly parents as well. So that typical sandwich generation conversation. And executive functioning, of course, is all the things that are really impacted by being an ADHD, which I'll come back to. So that's the first thing. I think then in terms of the burnout picture, we've been juggling a gazillion balls and we've been able to do that, but there's still too many. We've been over-functioning for too long. And so we bring into this stage of life a very, very exhausted woman. And so there's not much of a buffer for us. It doesn't take adding too much more to the picture, because we're already almost at full capacity, probably at full capacity, some of us, that, you just add one more stressor, one more kind of thing, and yeah, it's just too much. You're now overflowing, and you're just simply not coping. And that one more thing then becomes perimenopause, which for the vast majority of us, anywhere between kind of 65 and 75% of women will actually experience symptoms of perimenopause that are impactful, that in a negative way. Yes, there are some women who blink and miss it, but they are definitely in the minority. And the relevance of all of that picture is you are getting somebody in midlife whose resources are already stretched, if not already depleted. And then they've got this hormonal kind of rock show that begins that automatically, and I'm not sure whether yourselves or your listeners know this, but our estrogen, in particular, is known as being neuroprotective. And one of the things that's also really helpful for us is managing our cortisol. Now, that doesn't mean just, when we're prior to perimenopause, when we've got buckets of estrogen, that we can just keep loading ourselves up with stress without any consequence. There's definitely that point. That's the point of burnout and exhaustion, is there is that ceiling. But what happens but because it is protective for cortisol, when you kind of cortisol when your estrogen's high, your cortisol is at the lowest it can be, kind of thing. So when we're losing our estrogen, then that seesaw starts to change. We could have everything in our lives actually stay the same. And just the fact that we're hitting perimenopause, we are going to be more cortisol sensitive, and we're going to have more cortisol running through our system. So straight away, we're already more stressed. We're already at the end of our tether. We're already more easily overwhelmed. And, with that then so we've got this increased demand, this increased stress at a time when we're least resourced, basically. And that's one of the pictures as to why our strategies start failing us, because we just can't use them as effectively, as often as we normally would be able to. So that's the first thing. We also know, that there's a number of kind of theories around the role of estrogen with dopamine, and dopamine, how that works for ADHDers, or how it's, do we have not as much as a neurotypical person in terms of dopamine, or do we have the same amount but we use it either too fast? That's definitely one kind of thought, or that we just don't use it as efficiently. There's lots of different ideas, and we're still kind of, not necessarily really firm in what is going on with our dopamine, but we know it's relevant to ADHD. It's a neurotransmitter of motivation. And I think that's a really important thing for us to know, that whatever is happening with our dopamine, and however it works or isn't working as well as neurotypical people, straight away it's the thing that is relevant to motivation. And so if it's not working well, then our motivation is not going to be so great. But we know that there's a really good and tight relationship between estrogen and dopamine. And so this is one of the reasons why that's being proposed, that ADHD kind of challenges are also really revealing themselves during this period of time, because dopamine's friend estrogen isn't actually coming out to play as often. It's not there to be helpful. And we know that estrogen, as I said, is more broadly neuroprotective, body protective. We've got estrogen receptors everywhere. We know it's so protective for so many other physical kind of health conditions, mental health conditions. It's no surprise then if we also kind of think about that it's probably helpful in managing in helping us, kind of at our peak executive functioning. And so when it starts being in short supply, obviously in perimenopause, there's massive peaks, but there's this overall decline, and there's certainly crashes that, it's no surprise that we have challenges. And some of this is drawn from the research around younger women who've known that they're ADHDers, and what they've seen is that in the luteal phase, so in the days before their period, when we have an estrogen crash, a lot of women who already know that they're ADHDers, they're not in the perimenopausal period, will find either their medication's not as effective, or their challenges, ADHD challenges are more pronounced. And, you know, in a glib kind of way, perimenopause is one long luteal phase. There's definitely spikes of estrogen, which is not, is not part of the luteal phase. But that overall decline is part of the, you know, we have a crash basically before we get our period in our estrogen. And, you know, this is what's happening during perimenopause. We're getting less and less and less and less estrogen. And so that data from pre-perimenopausal ADHD women is also providing a bit of an explanation as to why are we seeing this more now? Why are women experiencing more symptoms now? As well as the knowledge that there's an overcorrection of a lack of diagnosis, because we've had this really tight picture of what ADHD looks like in people, and it hasn't included women. The research around it hasn't included women in our famous diagnostic statistical manual, which sets the criteria for mental health disorders as well as neurodevelopmental differences. Still called disorders in that book, but I use the word differences. So, you know, people being able to access more information around ADHD and perimenopause, kids being spotted earlier, which then exposes the parents to what this ADHD kind of gig looks like, understanding there's a big genetic link to it, recognizing that the symptoms show up differently in women and knowing what those are, as well as then understanding this kind of luteal phase picture, you know, is part of what explains this apparent explosion of women getting, you know, a late diagnosis of ADHD.
Some of that is really new to me. That's really interesting. I'm curious from a personal perspective, Kirstin, of how, because one of the things that I think we're hearing a lot, because we are seeing that explosion, right? It's like, I mean, I've probably curated my feed in a particular way, so I see it a lot. But there certainly is a conversation happening around this idea of like, yeah, is this like a trend? Is it trendy now to be ADHD? And I think that maybe makes some women resistant to even exploring it, because it's like, you know, I don't know if I just want to jump on the trend, like, which is not what it is at all. But from your personal experience being late diagnosed, what has the impact been on you knowing that once you took your year to accept it? Which I hear is also very common for people to really question that diagnosis. And I know I've had that conversation with my psych too. I'm like, I just anyway. But what has been the impact for you on knowing that, and has it changed how you do things?
Yeah, it's been a huge impact for me. And in fact, I have had some people say, why do you need to kind of lead with that? Not that I say, hi, I'm Kirstin, I'm an ADHDer when I meet new people, but it's certainly something I lead with professionally for sure. And because it's so important to me to support women who are also going through the same thing. And it is very much a part of my identity now. I spent however many years, I was 46 when I was diagnosed, understanding myself through the lens of my life experiences, my family environment, my role in the family, all of the things that our psychologists kind of talk with clients about, you know, in terms of what shapes us. I used all of those things, and all of those things are still really, really relevant. But clearly there was one big thing missing for me. And I think because, you know, I mentioned before, I felt like a square peg in a round hole in some ways. Maybe I didn't mention it, but you know, I did. Okay. And you know, there was part of that was that I've been largely comfortable with that all my career, but it's still been like, why am I feeling like this, and why am I doing my career so differently to what my peers were doing at the time? And you know, I do remember saying to my ex-husband when we were married, he's such a public servant kind of fellow, and I remember saying to him, I so wish I could be your public servant wife, but I just can't. And I didn't have an explanation for it. I just could not be confined to Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 in the same place, you know, years and years on end. And I mean, I have friends who've had 3 rounds of long service leave, and I'm like, oh God, this is what I've missed out on, but I still wasn't capable of it. And I often joke I've had a real job. So I have actually been a government employee, but it's short-lived because it doesn't allow me the flexibility and the freedom and the creativity that is absolutely important to me. And so for me, it's given me a really important explanation for why I have been this professional square peg in a round hole for a Gen Xer. It's also socially, I mean, I have really, really long-term friendships from when I was an adult, and I'm just quietly, I think a lot of them are neurodivergent. And then I have a lot of, kind of friendships I've developed over the last, period of time in my life. But certainly in primary school and high school, I was a kid who got along with everyone and moved between groups. And that never also made sense to me. It's kind of like, why can't I just stick with one group? And I think it was because I just never felt like I fully belonged. There was just something in that, obviously you can hear I can't quite articulate it because I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. But I really feel as though that was an ADHD kind of thing for me, of trying to find my people and not feeling quite like I belonged, because there was this difference. Like you, I mean, I remember my geography teacher saying to my parents that I would, what did he call me? A good girl rebel. Because I did think differently and I did speak my mind, probably impulsively and interrupting in the process. But at the same time, I wanted to be good. I wanted to be liked. I didn't like getting into trouble. I was very sensitive to all of that kind of stuff. A lot of my rebellion, certainly from my parents' perspective, they wouldn't have known about. I was very good at kind of doing these things you shouldn't be doing without them knowing. Maybe they knew. Parents sometimes know more than you think they do. I've learned that as a parent. But I think some of those things played out for me. So, does that matter now? Well, in some ways it helps me lay those queries to rest, those things of why was I like that in primary school and high school, and why am I someone who doesn't still have friends? I mean, I do have a couple of long-term friends because we grew up in the same street from the day we came home from hospital being born, but I'm not someone who has friendships from my primary school and high school years, and yet I can see that other people do. I feel in my early 20s was when I found people I could really just truly be myself with. And that's why there's that longevity. And as I said, probably there's a bunch that are neurodivergent that, don't know that. The biggest impact, the best impact is self-compassion. Grace, self-compassion, really recognizing how my brain works, really knowing that I will give absolutely everything I have to something I'm intrigued by, interested in. If you want an expert in something, find an ADHDer who's interested in that thing, and they will know everything, and they'll be deeply, deeply committed to it. So I can really see a lot of the gifts that it's given me. And I can also really recognize the stuff that I don't do well, which is largely house stuff like yourself, Erica. Those things aren't important to me, and they're not interesting enough. Understanding the ADHD brain is driven by interest and urgency, not importance, certainly not importance to others, unfortunately, has been really, really critical. It's really helped me with my kids, very much helped me with my kids as they're navigating, what do I do as a career, as my next step, and all that kind of stuff. I'm able far more to see the gifts, and I wouldn't want to change those things. I've had a fabulous career, like super fabulous, and it is because of my ADHD. Did my marriage end maybe because I was an ADHD? I think it played, and didn't know it. I think it played a role. But again, I've moved on, grieved that, moved on, and found someone who probably is also neurodivergent, to be honest, and am also really able to be myself and not have that I wish I was a public servant for you. And he is also very public servant. He's autistic, but there's just, I'm in a place where I am surrounded mostly by people who are very accepting of all the ADHD-ness, even if they don't label it as such. And that's been the absolute blessing for me, for sure.
I love that. I love that you said the greatest gift was self-compassion, because I think that's exactly what I would articulate too, in terms of, I don't even have my diagnosis, but in terms of looking through that lens. And that's one thing that I think can be really valuable for women too, is even if they aren't planning to go down that path of official assessment and diagnosis, to stop fighting the natural way that you are. I think that's like such an important thing, because so much of the time we're just trying to find all the hacks that essentially make us more neurotypical. Yeah. And it's like, what if you just don't do that? What if we just let ourselves be how we are and let that be okay? I think that's amazing. And, the house gets cleaned when there's urgency, because somebody's coming over. So it's fine.
And I also think, we have a harder time with some of these things because it is typically that kind of running a house and having a family that can be the biggest challenge. We can be amazing in our careers and have those challenges there. But men who are ADHDers don't have the same baggage around the fact that they don't run a house well or run a family well. And so there's a lot of gender stuff. Women get that anyway, whether you're an ADHD or not.
That's right.
This expectation, but add to the picture that you're an ADHD and therefore you really struggle with those things. There is a lot of shame around that. And I guess, for me, it's like, well, hang on a minute. Why is it my job? Why is it my job to do all these things, the thinking and the doing? It kind of is in some regards as a single parent, but and having been that for a while. But certainly as my kids have grown up, to be honest, just speaking about the washing thing, my boys have been doing their own washing since they were 14. I just was like, I'm not going to do it. I cannot cope with my own, let alone yours as well. And they're ADHDers, and yes, sometimes that means they're washing and putting it in the dryer at 11 p.m. at night, and it's right near my bedroom, so I hear it go clunk, 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 clunk outside my bedroom. But it's, it's just why do I have to be the one, just because I'm the female, the mum, the adult in this house, to do all these things? So don't get me wrong, I still criticize myself, but way less often. And I'm quicker to kind of challenge that and show some grace and ask that question, why do I feel guilty for this? And it's usually because I'm taking responsibility for something that, particularly now my kids are older, it isn't just my responsibility. Certain things in the house just aren't. Yeah.
Yeah. Anita, I know that you've been on mute because the dog's been barking. But now that the dog is not barking, I feel like I've asked all the questions. Is there anything you want to say? Is there anything you want to ask now that you've got a moment of quiet in the background?
Now that I've realised I'm ADHD and I've been quietly sitting back and wanting to say a heap of things, yes. I just appreciate so much, because that question you asked, Erica, was the one that's been burning for me, is now that you have the diagnosis, what difference has that made to your life? And I think, in hearing your explanation too, Kirstin, how beautiful it is that I sensed from that, and I sense it in myself as well. You have a deeper appreciation of who you are and your identity, and with that there is some acceptance, and then maybe there's not, but I think too understanding who you are would be a big part of having that formal diagnosis. And then I also think that this is the brilliance of post-menopause, is that things settle, and so that estrogen wild ride that we're talking about in peri, which, will make things a lot more intense in many ways, they do plateau, I found. And so, yes, there are things that are now becoming apparent to me in the conversation. I go, oh, okay. My son, incidentally, who works with neurodivergent kids, have said to me, Mum, you're so ADHD, you should know. But is that with postmenopause, as the estrogen kind of things stabilize, maybe we're left with what we're left with. Does that make sense? So things have been peeling, things are bubbling up because the estrogen's peeling away or becoming lower.
Yeah,
and then we plateau. So what we've got.
Definitely. And, I think what happens when our hormones, even though they're way lower, plateau, is it gives the brain an opportunity to do its marvelous neuroplasticity kind of thing. It's not possible for it to compensate while there's so much fluctuation, but it can once there's stability. And, I've just, my personal experience is I needed the support of medication for ADHD during my perimenopausal years. It was really helped, not mind-blowingly like some people, but it was definitely valuable and helpful for me. But I'm a couple of years into menopause now, and I don't take it anymore. I'm still occasionally washing 3 times, and all, like those things just still aren't important to me, so they can still happen. But from a professional perspective, I feel clearer again, that so the stability has occurred because I am well into menopause, and it's returned me to what feels a little bit like my prior functioning, which is still a bit chaotic and ADHD at times.
Beautiful.
And
That's right. Yeah.
It's a very grounding experience. As I said, whether you're ADHD or not, like perimenopause is a significant transition where we have this opportunity to really come into our own as midlife women. Archetypally, we move into our queen chapter, wise leaders. That feels very true for me for the midlife women I work with who aren't ADHDers. ADHDers have just that added layer to kind of work through. But when we do, we come out the other side with 2 feet firmly on the ground most of the time. And that feels really good after you've had the rug pulled out from under you. So, yeah.
It really does. Yeah. And the other thing I've been wondering too is the way the female brain works, hormonally aside, or maybe though hormones might contribute. Do you remember the old videos that were out there where they were talking about this? I forget who this person was, but he was talking about the male brain and the female brain and how the male brain is in boxes, and that's how men think, right? It's very linear, logical. I will think about this one thing, I will put it in the box, put the lid down on the box, and then I'll put it to the side and I'll grab the next box and I'll think about that. Whereas women have this fireworks, right? It's just this electrical network. If you can imagine lots of fairy lights just being in a giant ball of wool almost, that's our brains. And I'm wondering too whether that physiology of how our brains naturally work comes into play with this too, and whether that's why it's not picked up, because for many of us that's how we think. We're able to handle, multitask, we can do 3 or 4 things at once. So I don't know, what do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, what I hear and would agree with is that there's this feminine way of being in the world, and there's a feminine way of kind of thinking, and we can hold multiple threads of conversation and hold many things in mind. I would totally agree, I guess, with that. And what's going to interest me is whether we get to a point where we're finding more women being diagnosed with ADHD, more females diagnosed with ADHD than males. Because there's a part of me that thinks that might happen, because I feel as though there are some parts of ADHD that I have seen more commonly and often in women, including neurotypical women. So, I mean, I look forward to the day where maybe ADHD actually kind of almost isn't a thing. It's just we recognize that all brains are different. It just is this wide acceptance, and we all get to leverage off our strengths, and we all get support for and accommodation support and, accommodations for some of the things that aren't so great. That will be a nice world. I think we're a way away from that though, but nonetheless, it wouldn't surprise me if we really start seeing the numbers increase in women.
I agree. I see that a lot too. Yeah. I reckon that we're going to see a big increase in women's diagnosis of both ADHD and autism as we understand it more. And then eventually, and we probably won't be here to see it, I really do believe it will become this has always been the case, that, you know, a really large percentage of the population thinks like this. And it was just never okay, you know, to divert from neurotypical. And so, yeah, I think that will be the eventual outcome too, which is cool. But yeah, probably not our lifetime.
We know that diversity is inherent in nature, and diversity is what has enabled nature to continue to exist.
Yes.
And yeah, I think it's just how it is with humans too. So
makes sense.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at the time, and I guess
to look at the professions. Oh, sorry.
You go. We spoke at the same time. You go.
I think there's a bit of a lag too with our mics, which is messing things up a bit. Yes, you're right. We should probably wrap it up. It says it's an hour. I would love to explore this more, and even from a professional point of view, you know, the number of small business owners who might, you know, wouldn't fit that profile. I'm the same. Don't fence me in organic chicken. Like, I can't, you know. So I'm just wondering whether that would be an interesting conversation too, looking at it from a career point of view and professional point of view, where we're naturally drawn to.
I really believe there's something in that. I really, really do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Wow. Great.
Amazing.
Yeah. Well, there's all three of us that have to try and curb the chatting.
We need like the old
over to you,
stick.
Erica.
Who's got the speaking stick? Thank you, Kirstin. And that's the funny thing, right? It's like you notice the urge in your head, and that's where, you know, it might not be obvious to anybody else, but you are controlling the urge not to speak over people all the time. I have to do it all the time. It's like a lot of effort. Anyway, Kirstin, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming and sharing with us again. We love you, and we love you know, having your professional and personal experiences here on the podcast. So thank you so much. If people want to connect with you, do you want to just share where they can find you on the socials and the internet?
Yeah, probably the easiest is Instagram, you know, the Midlife Psychologist with underscores between each word. And I also am the founder of All About Her Centre, which if you put All About Her Centre, that's the Instagram handle, and also the website. And on that website, you'll find a bunch of psychologists and therapists who are very, very across perimenopause and menopause kind of challenges, really. And then a number of us also in the ADHD, that intersection of the two. So, yeah, please check us out.
Amazing. Anything else, Anita?
So good. Thank you. No, other than a huge thanks. And do hop into All About Her, because the resources are astoundingly brilliant, and I know they're very well researched and thought through. So thank you for all the work that you do in that space, Kirstin. Much appreciated.
My pleasure. It's my obsession. Easy.
What a healthy obsession. That is so wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Kirstin. So welcome. Thank you again.
Thanks so much. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for Midlife Unfiltered. If you loved this episode, you're going to love what's coming next. Be sure you're subscribed on your platform of choice so you don't miss a thing.
We'd also be delighted, and for sure do a little happy dance, if you took the time to leave us a rating and review. Those not only absolutely make our day, but more importantly, it helps other women who may be wanting something more from their midlife to know about us and to listen in as well. You can connect with us on socials too. You'll find links to connect on LinkedIn, Instagram, and email in the show notes.